Hi, this is Dinkle's Woodshop, but you might also know me as Bridgid because that's my legal name according to the United States government. Or so I thought. I'm here today with my wedding photo and a cheese stick. And I'm going to show you how I created this walnut picture frame using mostly hand tools. I created this picture frame using primarily my jack plane and this thing here called a shooting board. So this is my hand plane. This is a pretty good all-purpose, jack plane, and it's basically just a blade, kind of like a chisel, but it's held at a fixed angle inside the plane body, and it has this flat sole here, and the blade protrudes a little bit or a lot based on how much you turn the knob. And so that allows you to take very regimented shavings on your wood. So miter joints are surprisingly difficult. They seem really simple, and that's what makes them difficult to get right because there's absolutely nowhere to hide in this joint. And I recently just finished reading The Why and How of Woodworking by Mike Pekovich. It was for the Woodworkers Book Club, but he has a little section in there called Respect the Miter. And I love that concept. Miters are simple, but miters are really tough to get right. Unlike a dovetail, which is fairly simple to cut, but strikes fear in our hearts, the humble miter can catch us off guard if we're not careful. The miter's seeming simplicity can lull us into not doing our best, giving us a sense that somehow it's undeserving of our full effort. And once we slide down that slope, we're in for some hurt. Okay, so how is this picture frame gonna go together? It's pretty simple. I had an old picture frame from Walmart, which I harvested all the non-wood components from. So the glass, this backing board, and the little brackets. And then the rest is going to be built and dimensioned off of those existing components. And then I also created this unique mat in Photoshop for the picture. I just wanted something a little bit special. So you may or may not have seen a shooting board used before. So this board's going to serve two purposes. It's going to hold my workpiece at this exact 45-degree angle against this fence with respect to my hand plane. And it's also going to prevent end grain tear out here. So I'm going to set my hand plane on its side and it's going to ride back and forth on this fence while the blade slices at this end grain. So end grain is the most difficult part of the wood to work because it contains the dense array of these wood fibers and it's incredibly subject to tear out, and it's also very difficult to cut through if you don't have sharp tools. And so that's where my cheese stick comes in. I've always thought of wood as like a string cheese stick. I think it can provide a good analogy for wood grain. The cheese stick is constructed of many long fibers of cheese, which are held together in one cheese log and can be peeled off easily. My cheese stick. So the sides of the cheese stick are analog to like the face grain or edge grain of the wood, and the end of the cheese stick represents the end grain. The end grain holds this dense bundle of cheese fibers together, and if you work across the end grain without proper backing support, you risk grabbing one of these long cheese fibers and taking it with you. And that's what happens when you have end grain tear out or end grain blowout. And I'll show you what happens when I work on end grain without any backing board. And so this fence right here is the stabilizing force for my end grain to prevent it from tearing out like crazy, as well as holding it in the 45-degree position. But all this talk about cheese has made me hungry, so let's go talk about today's sponsor. Did someone say Christmas in July? Well, I just did. This episode of Dinkle's Woodshop was kindly sponsored by Kris Kringle's Discount Pringles. Pringle prices so low, you'll be asking yourself, is this legal? Kris Kringle offers a wide variety of flavors, including Pizza Palooza, Meat Lover's Medley, Nightmare Surprise, Real Trout Time, and Borscht. Thanks again, Kris Kringle. All right, so now that we know why we're using this shooting board, let's talk about how I built this one. It's super simple. I just have two pieces of 3/4 inch MDF. I think this is the factory edge. I was relying on that to be square. So I just took the smaller piece of MDF, screwed it on top of the larger piece, and then I took this piece of cherry and I roughly cut it at a 45-degree angle on my table saw. This angle doesn't have to be perfect right now, and I'll show you why later. And then I used a wide array of measuring and marking tools at my disposal to mark the 45-degree angle for the fence and screw it into place. And this is where some of my trials and tribulations began. I'm not going to get too much into it because you guys don't need a 73-minute compilation of me trying to make a 45-degree angle with a bunch of different tools. But the short of it is I ended up using this angle gauge in tandem with my combination square to mark my 45-degree angle. And so I knifed that 45-degree angle onto the MDF and screwed the fence into place with the fence hanging a little bit over this edge. And so now that I had the fence attached and it was hanging over the edge just a little bit, I took my hand plane on its side and I planed the fence flush to the MDF. And then I checked that this dimension here was square, and now my shooting board is ready to go. Except I need to do a little bit of troubleshooting. So I feel like in every miter shooting board instruction video I watched, they were just like, take a speed square and just put it on the MDF and then mark it. And then mark your fence and then you're gonna go. And that wasn't the case for me. I tried my best to get that perfect 45-degree fence position, and I did a bunch of test cuts, and some of them were still out of square. And to have any issues with your miter, it's gonna compound over all the four corners of the picture frame. So you really have to make sure it's in square. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. So this is where we get into the troubleshooting process. So first I cut a sample miter joint and then I butted it up against my square. And then I checked to see if there were any gaps. That's how much my miters are off by. You can see there's the slightest little gap. Because without the square they push together just fine, but it's not actually 90 right there when they're pushed together. So I have to reevaluate my shooting board. So if there's a gap at the bottom of the miter, then it means there's not enough material being taken off at the top. So the top of the joint needs to hang off the shooting board more, meaning my fence needs to swing up. Conversely, if there's a gap at the top of the miter, it means my fence needs to swing down. And these animations I'm showing you are very dramatic for educational purposes, but I need you to know that the adjustments I was making were so small, like the thickness of a sheet of printer paper. And so I continued troubleshooting back and forth, pushing that fence a little bit up, pushing it maybe a little bit down, until finally I had a miter joint that was perfectly square. And I know this is a lot of talking, this is a lot of yapping, but it was really important for me to get this shooting board just right so that it will serve me in the future and I will be able to rely on it in the future and not have to fuss with anything in the future. Okay, time to actually build this picture frame and cut the miters for real. So I milled up some walnut stock I had, and then I measured out how big I wanted my picture frame to be. And so I roughly cut all my miter joints at a 45-degree angle with a handsaw, and you can see the finished surface from the handsaw. It's super rough. There's all these lines, but that's okay because we're gonna use the plane to clean it up. So to use my shooting board, I had my miters, I butted them up against the fence, and then I protrude the work stock ever so slightly as I sweep my plane back and forth on the shooting board. And I started with taking very, very light cuts. If you take heavy cuts with the shooting board, especially on the end grain is so dense, it's so hard to cut through. So if you take a really heavy cut, your plane's gonna be jumping around, your work stock's gonna be jumping around, and it's just gonna be a mess. Take as light of a cut as possible, and you can see here I'm taking these like thin shavings. You can see me holding them up to the light. You can see all those pores. You can see the structure of the end ring. Very cool. And I marked all my miter joints with a knife. So I'm just working to that knife line at my shooting board. But yeah, after days and days of fighting with this shooting board, this was the first shooting board I ever made. So, you know, I'm not super experienced with this sort of thing. So I was fighting with it for a long time. But after I finally got it together, it was smooth sailing. And I was super excited to see this really special frame come together for this very special photo. And, you know, now that I'm married, I decided to change my last name. That was something I wanted to do. So I went to the United States Office of Social Security, as you do if you want to change your name. And I was like, hey, I got married. Can I change my last name to my husband's? And the lady at the counter was like, yeah, sure. Just fill out this document. And I was like, okay, here's my documentation. here's my marriage certificate and here's my social security number. And she was like, okay, this is going to take like literally 2 seconds. And she was like, okay, here's all your information. Print it out. Just make sure your address is spelled right and your phone number's right and that everything looks good. And I was like, okay. And I look at it and it says that my first name is Brigio, Bridgio. And I was like, oh, you had a typo. It's a D at the end. You accidentally put an O. And she was like, no, that's your name is Brigio according to the Office of Social Security. And I was like, huh? And lo and behold, I look at my social security card. It's a sans serif font. And now knowing what I know now, look at that says Brigio. This whole time. And she was like, if you want to change it, you got to bring back your birth certificate. Somebody made a typo at the Office of Social Security 30 years ago. My birth certificate was handwritten. Handwriting was kind of sloppy. They said, does this say Brigio? Is Brigio a name? But I got it fixed. Thankfully, the Office of Social Security has switched to a very distinct serif font. So hopefully this doesn't happen again to any other unassuming individuals like myself. So anyways, back to my frame. Once the miters were cut, they were all right dimensions, looking good. I used my router table to cut the rabbet that's going to hold the glass and the backing board. And then another small thing I had to do was I took a crosscut saw and I kind of jimmy rigged this little tiny groove, and that very small groove is going to hold the brackets on the backing board that's going to hold everything in together. But yeah, once all of that joinery, whatever was cut, it was time to glue up. And miter picture frame glue ups can be pretty simple. You don't need to get any crazy picture frame ratchet strap clamp thingy. You can just use blue painter's tape. So you put blue painter's tape on each underside of the miter, glue on the miters, hinge it together, and that will provide enough clamping pressure if your miter joint is sound. And then once the glue was dried, I decided to add some quick splines to the miter joint. And miter joints are pretty weak because they're all end grain. It's not a super strong connection. It creates a stabilizing force between that end grain miter joint. And would this picture frame have been fine without the splines? Probably, but I just wanted to add them. And I think the contrasting walnut grain provides a nice visual detail. And then after all that, I flushed up all the surfaces with my jack plane and a card scraper. And I finished it with some spray shellac, just pretty basic. It was really exciting for me to be able to do all the finishing work with like my hand plane and a card scraper because I'm really proud of how much I've been able to integrate my hand tools into my shop in the past year, because it's always been a struggle for me. I have been very slow to pick up hand tools and gain any basic proficiency with them. All right, and there you have it. That's my picture frame for me and my husband's wedding photo, and I'm really happy with how it came out. So I hope you learned something, and this is Brigio signing off for the day.